Welcome. I wanted to try and do something tonight a bit philosophical, and then at the same time present a few ideas. And then I discovered that this is a very any one of those topics, mind, body, or spirit, could could take a discussion in itself. So trying to put these three things together was a bit of a challenge. However, because a couple of weeks ago I attended a mind, body, and spirit fair. I thought, well, because people link them together, let's sort of see what happens when we link them together. So we're going to launch into what I consider to be an outline of the debate. I'm going to share some ideas, and then with your collective expertise and understanding and knowledge and wisdom, maybe we can just sort of conclude with some kind of shared ideas about what this thing is or what these three things are. Um, because I personally, the psychologist in me is aware that the mind plays a really big part in the work that I do and the thing that I get involved with. And when I do my performance stuff, of which I've got some shows come up in the new year, sort of Darren Brownie things, I'm focused on the mind and the way the mind affects the body in order to do the kind of things that I do. And when you throw spirit into the mix, we've got this really complicated idea of what the hell is going on. And then somebody mentions the word soul, and we're now I am now trying to consider all these different things in my head. So I thought one way for me to help straighten it out would be to write some things down, share it with you, and then you can help me straighten my head out. And that's the plan. So in order to set the framework for this debate and discussion, I think it's useful to go over some of the key thinkers in the area of mind, body, and spirit that may or may not have influenced your thinking specifically, and certainly my thinking. So the first of the people really is the Buddha. Buddha really taught that the world is made up of mind and matter that work together. And if you don't mind, I don't matter. But I'm really influenced by that idea of the impact the mind has over the material world and vice versa. And because I've read some interesting philosophical ideas, and because I like the film The Matrix, which, is it the mind that's creating the illusion of reality, or is the illusion of reality that thing that we're living in? And therefore, what is real becomes a question. We could go down another rabbit hole there. However, Plato described the body as a prison for the soul, which I think is really interesting. The soul, that the thing that spiritually we talk about, the soul rising and ascending and surviving, that's the body is merely a prison for it, and so it's a vehicle for the soul to move around. And Aristotle, Plato's student, sort of believed that the body was a sign or an instrument for the soul, a similar kind of idea. But again, therefore, the only purpose of the body, according to these two thinkers, was to let the soul move around. It's like the body was the car and the soul were the passengers in the car, or the passengers in the car. And then, of course, one of the Christian thinkers, a guy called Thomas Aquinas, who you may have come across in any kind of RE you did at school, believed that the mind and the body are one. And he liked the idea too that it's like seal and wax. Yeah. That they're linked in that way. And I think, well, that's kind of an interesting idea. And it was, quite an interesting thought from a very religious thinker. We all have heard of Rene Descartes, whose famous phrase is, I think, therefore I am. And I think that's a really interesting statement. If you think, then you are. If you don't think, then you're not. And he kind of believed that the mind and the body were distinct and different from each other. And so he really developed what's become known as dualism, mind body dualism, that the mind is one thing and the body is something else, and maybe they meet in the middle. Yeah. A guy called Spinoza was a Jewish philosopher who believed that this idea of two things was crazy. There was only one thing, one substance that was called God or nature. And to try and create any distinction um, for him was not making any sense at all. Spinoza is quite an interesting philosopher, very complex, and I didn't really understand all of his stuff, but I got that bit. More modern thinkers, yes, 1632 and 1704 was quite modern. A guy called John Locke, um, he believed that the mind itself, when it comes into the world, is a blank slate, which he called a tabula rasa. And it, it didn't have any ideas of what it should be and what it was. And then, according to our upbringing, the mind got filled with patterns and shapes and forms, which it starts to call reality. And he also kind of suggested that the spirit was a separate entity, and was linked with the idea that the mind got filled because the sensations that came into it. And he reckoned that there were sensations as inner sensations, which is what we experience inwardly, and reflections of sensations, which were outer things, which opens up a really interesting question. There are lots of bits of ideas that suggest that we see the world as we want to see it. The world is a reflection of what we see, and I'm kind of uh, brought into that idea a little bit in the sense that I think the world is how we choose to see it, and our belief system shapes the world. I think I've been quoted as saying in the past that I don't believe that seeing is believing. I believe that believing is seeing, and maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. But by the 17th century, the Western world began to think that the mind and the body were separate in some way, and clinical observations in the 18th century started to get people more and more interested in what was going on in the mind as opposed to what was just going on in the body. And today, we have this idea that the mind produces everything. In fact, the mind is a product of the working brain. If the brain is working well, we get a concept of self, we get a concept of identity, we get a concept of reality, and therefore the mind or consciousness is the product of a working brain, and that opens all kinds of questions, because if the mind and understanding of spiritual processes is a product of the emerging brain, then there's no need to consider spirit or soul, because the brain does it all, which is a very reductionist idea, reduces it to one thing. But a lot of modern thinkers believe that. And if you read modern atheist philosophers, and particularly atheist thinkers, they will actually say it's all nonsense talking about this, because it all comes down to brain function, which I think I personally have a problem with, or I don't quite get, or maybe I don't want to believe that it's just that. See, the brain, we know, does all kinds of incredible things. We know that it's our brain that helps us create connections of how we relate to the world. It's our brain that receives all the sensory input from what we see, what we hear, what we feel, and produces the thought processes. And it's perhaps the thought process that give us a sense of self. I am only me, according to some people, because my brain is functioning enough to process the sense, the the sense of myself. Yeah, and of course, if I can produce a sense of myself, then maybe I can produce a sense of an other self, which I may call spirit or soul or other planes of existence. And this totally materialistic view of the world, I think, is interesting, but personally, I think there's a bits missing. And I'm not sure whether the bits are missing in it because I emotionally want there to be other things, or whether because I'm just rejecting hard science, which is a bit unlike me because I'm quite scientifically minded, although I'm a mystic as well, hence rational mystic. So I hope you're hanging in there. I hope this is all making sense, or I'm trying to make sense of this issue. There were some very interesting experiments conducted by a guy called Persinger in the early 70s, 80s. And what he did was he connected people, volunteers, to equipment that would stimulate the outside of the brain with magnetic and electrical charges, so it would stimulate the insert side of the brain. The idea was to affect the neural pathways with electrical and magnetic charges. And people who were in these experiments wore what was called a Persinger helmet. It was this kind of head sort of garb of sensors and stuff. And what he was able to do was stimulate certain parts of the brain, which allowed the people to have a sense of them looking at themselves, which is quite interesting. This idea that if you stimulate a part of the brain, the person whose brain has been stimulating doesn't see the world through their eyes, they see it as the observer looking back at them, which is a totally weird thing. But it gave weight to the people who were saying that the brain produces self, and different kinds of brain can produce different aspects of how we perceive ourselves, which linked to ideas of brain chemistry being related to psychological disorders, which is very fascinating. And although I kind of enjoyed reading Persinger's work, there was still something missing for me, because it was kind of like trying to reduce human experience into a test tube. And I'm not sure we can do that. Or maybe again, I don't want to be sure that we can do that. Plato and Aristotle, with their views of what the brain were, this idea that there's an active intellect going forward and that the soul was something else that animated the body, I kept coming back to that idea that what we call the soul or the spirit of human beings, or the spirit of me, or the spirit of you, was something different. It wasn't just a product of my working brain. And then I started to look at an area that is now known as neuro-linguistic programming. It goes back to the sort of 70s, 80s, and it's an area of transpersonal psychology, if you like, or interpersonal psychology, or cognitive psychology. Difficult to know where it fits. And what NLP talks about, NLP is about the neurons, the brain, language, L for language, which is the way we talk about experience, and programming is just a fancy word for behaviors. The behaviors we have can be described in language, and our mind processing is described in language. But the challenge is that if our language is limited, our perception of what's going on with ourselves or of the outside world is also limited. So let me give you a real example of this that makes sense. If I say to you, every time I put a white shirt on, the car breaks down, that's a statement of my perceived reality. Now, the reason I use that example is that was my dad. I remember my dad saying to me he wouldn't wear a white shirt because the car would break down. And when I got old enough to talk to him about it, and when he got more relaxed enough me questioning this stuff, I discovered that really the car broke down once when he had a white shirt on. And what his mind had done was overgeneralized that situation, because it was probably a tough situation, to make that the rule. Because the brain wants to generalize things, wants to make everything simple. And so different people have different ways of they're called convincing strategies, in order to create models of how the world works. So, as far as my dad was concerned, he established the belief that if you wore a white shirt, the car would break down. Here's the interesting thing: I remember him wearing a white shirt when the car didn't break down. But because he held that belief of if I wear a white shirt, the car breaks down, he deleted all of that information about when he'd worn a white shirt. Give you another example that you'll all understand. I think most of us in the West certainly are familiar with the Father Christmas story at Christmas, right? Now, when you were a kid, I imagine that you were told that Father Christmas bought the presents at Christmas, and and there were certain conditions applied to that bringing of the presents. I know that my grandfather was a particularly imaginative person, and on Christmas Eve, when I know the parents put the stuff out, what he would do is he would leave a half chewed carrot and a half chewed mince pie and a half a drunk glass of wine on the mantelpiece because Father Christmas and Rudolph had had them, and he would actually put snow boot shaped patterns in the carpet leading outside. He also managed to find reindeer poo, which sparkled. I never understood that for a while. But when I was a kid, I knew that if I went to sleep, Father Christmas would come, and the evidence of him coming was there very obviously. It was the half-eaten mince pie, the half-eaten carrot, the half-drunk um, wine, the footprints, and the reindeer poo, and of course the presents. I had a belief that Father Christmas existed when I was a kid. Now, here's the thing: that belief of Father Christmas went extended so far that I interpreted everything I heard or saw or smelt on Christmas Eve when I should have been asleep as being the arrival of Father Christmas. I heard footsteps across the roof. I heard sounds of sleigh bells, which may have just been passing cars or bikes, but I interpreted the world according to my belief in Father Christmas. And that belief was maintained. My friends told me about Father Christmas. My teachers told me stories of Father Christmas. I had the evidence that Father Christmas and Rudolph had been, and I had the presents, like four legs of a table that supported my belief. And that's how I understood the world. Of course, later on, I'm told that Father Christmas doesn't exist, and my belief collapses, and my observations of, well, I know it's my granddad who chewed the carrot and ate the mince pie. I know that my granddad that very cleverly made the footsteps in snow boot prints in the living room, and I know that he'd found something that looked like reindeer poo with glitter in it. I know now what it was. It was actually that stuff you can buy. I would, animal feed. Did actually put some glitter in? But at the time, it was magical. But now I know it wasn't. My mind can go back to either of those stories and enjoy them. And the point I'm trying to make now is that every single one of us, our perceptions that fill our brain, that fill our beliefs in the world, are actually the result of our beliefs. The world exists out there, and we only see a small part of it. We interpret the rest through a very complicated system of neural networks. But there's something else that must be going on. Incidentally, many of you know, a lot of you know, I've been involved with all kinds of paranormal research over the years. I was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, etc., etc. And what I find interesting there is when you go to speak to somebody who's experiencing something, let's call it spiritual or lights in the sky or whatever, they will always interpret it according to their belief system. So if you put four people in a field and they see lights in the sky, one person is open-minded, another person believes in UFOs, another person believes in angels, and a third person believes in Father Christmas, they will all interpret those lights in the sky in their way, and they will add details to their perceptions. Now, I'm going a bit off track here, but the reason I wanted to talk about that was this is our brain affecting our mind, which is affecting our perceptions of the world. So when we start to talk about spiritual things, we've got to get by such a lot. We've got to bypass certain belief systems that become entrenched in us. And we are, most of us here are of a Judeo-Christian background. We were brought up with that as the background filter to everything. And so the moment we start talking about spirits or souls, we will have an emotional reaction to it, and it will be triggered by our belief systems, not by the reality itself. Okay, that was a side issue. I'll come back to it. Some very interesting questions that got to be answered. For example, where is the soul? What is the soul? Where is the soul? And different people have believed that the soul is either in the heart, which is why the Egyptians, which is why certain people have not valued the heart, or it's in the brain, which is why the Egyptians. I'll say that again. The Egyptians valued the heart because it went into a canopic jar. They didn't value the brain. But now we think that the spirit or the soul could reside in the brain. These different philosophical thinkings have actually influenced the way we've practiced religions in the past and now. And so just to try and summarize all that up in a rather more simple way than I've actually probably led you to believe, there is a mind-body problem. Forget spirit for a moment. There's a mind-body problem. First is the idea of what's called dualism, that the mind and the body are separate and then may not interact, or they can interact. There's the idea of monism, that there's only one kind, either material things or mental things. So the mind and the body are one. There's materialism, which is the idea that only the material world exists. There's physicalism, which is the idea that only matter and energy exist. And then there's idealism, which that only minds and mental events exist. There's others as well. There's mentalism, which I'm tending towards myself, which is the idea that it's the mind that creates meaning and therefore makes things exist. But all these philosophical ideas are quite important. And as we were growing up, there are things that we could have been exposed to in school to explore in quite simple ways, but we weren't. And I'll speak for me, I was put through an religious education program where, the idea of the Holy Spirit descending upon us and our souls moving up to heaven and all that, it was taken as a given that that was what the case. And it wasn't until I went to university, and many of you know I did geology as my first degree, but we were made to do a subsidiary subject and an arts subject, and I did theology as my subsidiary degree. And it was when I got into that philosophical stuff, I started to realize there are far more interesting questions about what dogmatic belief system tells us and what we can explore in an emotional and intellectual way. I know I'm going on, I'm really sorry. So that's the mind body. Now we've got the third one, the soul or the spirit. Are they the same? Some people believe they are the same. Some people believe they're different. In ancient Egypt, which, bang on about that because having been there, this time last year I was standing in the pyramids this time last year, but they believed that the soul had many parts to it. The Ba and the Ka and the Ren, or the Ib and the Shiut and the Sekhem, and they were all connected to animate this thing we called human beings. The Ba and the Ka were really interesting because the Ba was the personality and the Ka was this vital essence. And it was the Ka that traveled, and the Ba, the personality, was wrapped up. And the idea would be that the Ka and the Ba and all the other bits would actually be reconnected in an afterlife. Yeah. The ancient Greeks, of course, had completely different ideas. They had lots of ideas about everything. But really, they started to think about the idea of reason and spirit, and was spirit and soul the same thing? As a spirit of a place, is that the same thing as a human spirit? Do animals have spirits? Do plants have spirits? Those are things that are really important things to question. And then the early Hebrews had a concept of the soul, but it did not separate it from the body. These philosophers, these ideas, would have all been squeezed into a funnel to make what we would now call our Judeo-Christian upbringing. All these ideas were filtered into what we took on board as being the truth. So, in Christianity, for example, there is this belief that the body and soul are different. And I love this one. St. Augustine described the soul as the rider on the body, and the soul represented the true person. An individual soul was what that person was, and therefore the soul needed to be saved. Hence the Christian idea about, forgiveness, and the idea of repenting, and the idea of save your mortal soul. That's an interesting one. Save your mortal soul. See, that's a phrase. Really interesting. Hmm. Um, the Epicureans used to believe that the soul was made up of atoms like the rest of the body. It was no different. Aristotle believed the soul was a form inseparable from the body. As we've seen, Aristotle believed that soul animated the body. Other thinkers, like Heraclitus, believed that the soul was kind of like air, but not air, and kind of like fire, but not fire. And he thought that the soul animated certain motor functions within the body. Um, we're getting to the idea of the four elements and aether or spirit now. There were four: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit in the Western thinking. And he, it was defined that the word spirit comes from the Latin word spiritus, which originally meant breath or breathing. I find this interesting because I'm not going to go into it here, but the word psychic we have taken to mean something completely different in our culture to what it originally comes from. Because psychic also means breath or spirit. I think that's really interesting. It doesn't mean an ability. So we're into this area of, is the spirit and the soul the same thing? Is it the spirit that survives after death? Is it the soul that survives after death? If something is contacted by mediums, for example, what are they contacting? Be interested to hear the points of this later. Are they contacting the spirit of a deceased, or are they contacting the soul of a deceased, or are the two things the same thing? Is the spirit that which connects to God, hence the phrase Holy Spirit, or whatever you perceive God to be? And is the soul that thing that evolves because of your connection with spirit? And one of the things I'm really interested in when I go to mind body spirit festivals and to certain kinds of spiritual meetings, the discussion of the spirit and the soul is not one that most people want to have. The idea of mind, spirit, and soul, a lot of people don't want to go and have because they misunderstand the questions. They misunderstand my questions as wanting to be material, and I don't think that's what I'm asking about. I've spoken to some really well-known mediums, television mediums in the past, about spirit and soul, and it's a discussion they don't want to be brought into, really, because it would, to do so would actually start making them question the belief which defines their practice. I don't think it needs to, by the way, but that's their percept. And so are soul and spirit the same, or don't souls exist? They're not made of matter. They can't be located in time and space. Therefore, they don't exist. Interestingly, in the 1980s, I wish I could remember the name of the guy, but I can't. It's just got to my head. There was an experiment. In fact, I'll go back even earlier. It was in the early 1900s. One particular scientist thought that if soul existed, it would have a weight. And if you weighed somebody at the moment of their death, their physical weight would change because the soul would leave. And I think that's really interesting. And what happened over a number of years as this idea gained some popularity, there were some experiments done with people that were on the verge of dying being weighed and then weighed during death and weighed after death. And the figure of 21 grams was produced. And therefore, the weight of the soul could be assumed to be 21 grams, which is the title of a really good film about this stuff. But 21 grams. But what was not known at the time, or not thought about at the time, is the fact that the body loses fluid and changes composition anyway at the point of physical death. And so saying that the soul weighs 21 grams, it doesn't hold that much water, but an interesting idea because you can see the logic of the thinking. Of course, there's another group of people that believe that souls cause all the events that exist in the body. It's where the soul of the person, the center of the person, lives. And it's that soul of the person that energizes. And you've heard it said that person is such a loving soul. That person is such a caring soul. Do they have a caring soul, or are they a caring soul? Language is quite important here, and I just think these things are fascinating. And I'm just hoping that all I can do is get you to think about this for yourself. Because here's the truth: there are no real answers to this stuff. I don't think there are just beliefs. Which brings me to a tale to finish with. Um, the gloop. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but this is one of the first times I've really tried to formalize it a little bit. I'll tell you where it came from. When I first moved to Cornwall, I moved down here on my own, and it was a pretty interesting time taking up teaching in Cornwall, moving from London, and I was moving down for a reason, and that reason didn't pan out. So it was a particularly kind of stressful time, and I took up seriously whilst teaching meditation. I had a lot of spare time outside of teaching. I wasn't going out with many people. I didn't know many people, and I became a bit of a solitary soul, which was by choice. Okay, and because I was meditating a lot, I was getting to the practice of going out and doing my work, coming back and doing a session of meditation and then reading. And I think anybody who's done a lot of meditation may realize there comes a point when there is a physical interaction with the environment that they're in some way. Either the environment fades into nothing and you become one with everything, man, or, as in my case, something happened that led me to the sense of something else being present. And I started to, what for want of a better phrase would be, automatically write these ideas down, scribble them down. So as the ideas come, I kind of tried to cut out the editor and wrote and wrote and wrote. I wrote reams and reams of stuff, but the essence of which I've never really shared with many people, but I've still got somewhere in a piece of paper in the, somewhere, or on several pieces of paper. But what came to mind, and this is not new, none of what I'm going to say was new or original, but it was for me powerful. The idea of there being an essential self, and let's call it an everyday self. It was the spirit or soul and the persona, which is the physical thing. So hang in there, because I'm going to try and explain how this evolved a little bit and offer it for discussion and for thought. And this is a way for me to get past all the religious blocks of people's belief systems in order to explain something that for me I think is quite powerful. And I call this thing the gloop. And the gloop runs like this. The idea that the spirit or essence, whatever you want to call it, is this animating force, and it's our real inner selves, right? It's the spirit, we get a spirit of place. And I've deliberately chosen to do a wheel of the year there because it's that journey through life and journey through space and nature. And it's a natural thing. And I kind of think that when we visit a place like this beautiful place here, which is somewhere in Norway, I was a few years ago, we leave a trace of our spiritual essence there, like a fingerprint. Okay. And so that fingerprint is me visiting this place. Obviously, it's not that big. And of course, as more people visit, more and more fingerprints of their essence are left until eventually the place is so full of these fingerprints that when people who are sensitive to this go there, they pick up the fingerprints of the people who've been there. So, here there's only a small chance of me picking up the essence of the fingerprint. But if I go here and I'm open and intuitive, I start to pick up the essence of everybody that's been there. Now, these things are often emotional. They're not fingerprints, not real fingerprints. It's just a metaphor. These things we go are emotional, which is why if you go to some places, I believe, you can walk into a room where there's been an argument and there's been an argument, even if you were not there. When some friends have fallen out and you turn up later, you sense the atmosphere. It's because the very existence of our being there, if you like, our essence, our spirit, our living spirit, is there leaving an impression everywhere we go. And we can't help it, but we can manage it because you don't want to clutter up every space with negativity, right? But I think this is what people pick up. And so when sensitive people walk into an area and they pick up, what I think they're picking up on are these fingerprints. And these fingerprints are actually elements of their outer existence, their spirit of sense of themselves. I kind of think that there's an essential self, there's a material self that leaves the fingerprints, an essential self that is your mind, heart, imagination, everything going, which is the core of who you are, and ideas, thoughts, passions, dreams. And it's that bit that's said to survive death. Now, I think so far, most people, no matter their belief system, wouldn't find anything too difficult in those things. However, this is the gloop. The only way I could find to explain this was find a dish of soup with croutons in it. And you're going to have to hang in a little bit with me. The gloop, in my worldview, is the stuff of the intelligent cosmos. It's there. It's everywhere. But it's beyond words. There are no words for it because we can't experience it. It's the source, the beginning, the ending. It's the creative, destructive forces. It's non-personal. It's removed from what we mortals fret and worry about. This stuff of the universe. And when we talk about has kind of creative, destructive abilities, these are without emotion. They're with no judgment. It's like nothing. The best way I can describe this is to, as some of you may have heard me talk about before, is to go to a favorite television series of mine called Babylon 5. And Babylon 5 science fiction series, there is a character called Odo. And Odo thinks he's the last of his kind. And Odo looks like a human being and he walks around with the other people, interacts really, really well. He's got a very sharp mind. But Odo is a shapeshifter. Odo in the story can shift to different shapes. But none of those shapes are his natural form. His natural form is liquid that can be molded into whatever he wants it to be. And when he's at rest at his quarters, he's in a bucket. I refer to it as the bucket of gloop that is Odo. Now, the thing about Odo, Odo thinks he's the only person in the world of his kind. And he's working really hard to relate to all the other people in the stories, relate to the aliens, so he shapes and shifts to become them. But it's not him. That's his outer self. His inner self is the gloop. And he thinks all his people have been destroyed until one day in one of the episodes, he travels to a planet and there is a big lake, and that lake is the gloop of his other people, his ancestors who survived. And he goes back into the gloop, joins everybody, and becomes one. And there are no words to describe the experience that Odo has in this lake. He's glooping around with everybody. All right. But there's no body there because body is a construct that the gloop doesn't really know about or doesn't really experience. It's a gloopy thing. And then he steps out of the gloop and becomes shapeshifts to being human so he can communicate. And Odo is given the choice. He can either go back with these human beings to where he has been and then return to the gloop later to share his knowledge and learning. Or he can go back to the gloop and live there forever. You see, I think that this intelligent cosmos, as many Gnostics and people before us tried to suggest, was all the cosmos is trying to do is to understand itself, because it doesn't know itself. It's no place, there's no time, there's no thing. But the gloop therefore understands itself through the experiences of the things the gloop allows to be created. And so we get hints of that in biblical texts. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was God, and the Word was. What the hell does that mean? It's from John's Gospel, by the way. He existed in the beginning with God. God is just this word for this incredible gloop that we can't truly understand unless we're connected with it. Yeah. And the gloop, the word, gave life to everything that was created. Or put another way, in the kind of idea of Judaism, the idea that there was only God, only the gloop, and nothing else. And through the existence of the Kabbalah, which is the tree of life, which you go back to look at that mode, existence, non-existence became material. 3 worlds of transition: the gloop, Odo, the world. And I think it's really interesting, that idea. And here's the thing: if anything I've just said makes any sense at all, then whatever it is that animates us, the essential self, which is part of the gloop, loses its gloopiness when it becomes material and gets stuck in a material body, forgetting its origins, forgetting where it came from. Of course, it can go back to the gloop, and in fact does go back to the gloop, but then forgets who it was and becomes part of the gloop, taking with it only the experiences, the learnings from life, not the personalities, but the learnings of abstract concepts. So it's kind of like this. The gloop understands itself through incarnation. It fills all of the things that exist, and it experiences through that because it can't experience any other way. And then when we die, whatever it is, it goes back to the gloop and rests and relaxes. But the croutons are there for a reason. You see, if this happens again, then the gloop that's coming back has croutons in it. And those croutons might be memories of where it was before. I hope it doesn't sound too trivial when I say that, when we have so-called deja vu or past life experiences, I wonder if it's the bits of croutons in the gloop that are coming back into the people that we think we know, but we don't really. It's just that a gloop has been next to each other with a bit of crouton in it. I hope this is making sense. I hope this is not sounding like I've gone nuts. And if you've all turned off, then I definitely have gone nuts. Yeah. But it's just an idea to play with. Now, for me, the reason I like this is that I believe that any personal philosophy we have, the aim of a personal philosophy is to aim to a coherence. So having bits of philosophy grafted from place to place that don't sit together very well, I personally see as tension that I don't want to have. So if I want to accept that reincarnation is a possibility, what's the mechanism for it? Well, the gloop is the mechanism for it in this case, because bits of the gloop come back into different people. Or how is it I can meet somebody I've never really met before and feel an immediate connection? And it's not a past life thing, or I don't call it that. I just go, yeah. I think it's because the piece of the gloop in me recognizes the piece of the gloop in them. And this is a magical, wonderful thing. And it's not dismissing or trivializing anything to do with people's belief system about spirituality. It's just another way of looking at it and another set of languages. But for me, it's got an internal consistency. The gloop is the universe trying to understand itself. The mechanism it understands itself by is by creating life. We are part of the gloop. We can call it our soul if you want to. Our spirit interacts with the world, and that world is affected by our passing and our presence. The spirit of place, the spirit of understanding, the spirit of truth. The soul, or the essential self, is part of the gloop and goes back. And it goes back without any questions and without any, well, goes back without any identity or memory of who it was, except a sense of who it was. The reason I think this is important is that if the gloop is nothing and everything, it has to come into being. And one of the ways I think the ancient mystics talked about this was the universe was spoken into being. In the beginning was the word. In the beginning was the sound. Many traditions talk about the Om sound or the frequency of creation. And the way that I kind of started to think about this was if the creation goes through these levels, we can call it vibrations, which become sounds, sounds which become letters, words, letters become words, words become sentences. I'm communicating my idea to you through sentences, which are made up of words, which are made up of letters. And each time we go down this to creation, to the thing that's gross matter, I lose a sense of what I mean. I create misunderstanding without meaning to because I'm using sentences. And the sentences are made of words and letters. But we can't talk in simple vibrations yet. Maybe we can or could at one stage. And what happens is that as we become more and more physical, we become more and more dense and contain less and less of the original essence. And so we move from silence to dogma. And dogma is what drives our belief systems. I hope you're hanging in there. Last little bit coming up. And I think that's the reason we can't have conversations about some of these things, because it is very difficult to get silence and stillness around our words, because all of our words, all of our sentences hook into emotions and feelings. And sometimes we feel challenged and threatened when we want to talk honestly together. This, by the way, is one way of thinking about the Kabbalah, which is why I'm so keen on the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, because each sphere of the Kabbalah from the creative force becomes more and more dense and more material, but less and less godlike, cosmos-like, goddess-like, or whatever. So here we go. Last bit, please stay in. Here with this. If we start at the cosmos at the top, the cosmos seeks to understand itself. It is pure, pure soul soup, right? And because it's not uh, combative, there's no tensions, there's no personalities, there's nothing to drive it. It is kind of what we would consider to be bliss or heaven. All right. I'll come on to the hell in a moment. If I look at half of me, then I know I've got a body with physical needs. I've got my mind, my senses, emotions, but I also have spiritual aspirations that maybe want to desire my connection to the cosmos. And they can be expressed, my needs, my physical needs, they create behaviors, and they actually result of senses and belief systems which come here at the top here. So down this side, it's purely organic, an organic understanding of the nature of everything. But if I am becoming aware of becoming self-aware and questioning these things, I maybe aspire to connect with the cosmos, i.e., move towards what spiritual people in the past have called heaven. Of course, if I don't do any of that, I'm not willing to reflect that I end up in what we could call hell. Yeah, I get trapped in the same old repeating cycles of materialness because I'm not willing to change. On the other side of the things, we have the psychological aspects that consciousness is my ego, not a bad thing, because that's the aware of who I am, and it contains part of my sort of, if you like, essential self. But I project my essential self through a series of images, which we call the persona. All right. And they're reflections of me. They're reflections of my gloop, but not my gloop. And all of that, as Carl Jung decided, was affected by our memories that we don't know about, experiences maybe of unconscious, buried pains, or just forgotten about, or what he called denied psychic material, the idea that emotional, spiritual stuff happens to us and we deny it because we don't believe it, and so it's there. It also consists of basic animus qualities, the male and female, the yin and the yang. And Jung conceived of what he called a collective unconscious, which is the idea that stories of certain kinds of things relate across cultural, because we're part of a human species. We're part of a connection. So if I told a particular story to a particular group of people miles away, they'd still understand it because it connects to archetypes and ideas of this collective unconscious. But I believe, I think, that there is a universal transpersonal experience, which is the connection to the cosmos we all have. We may interpret it different ways, but we all have it. And my essential self is wanting to experience, take my experience back to the cosmos and then bring it back again. But I limit myself by my beliefs. So certain belief systems, when it comes to spiritual things, are have ceilings to them. Reincarnation is a particularly really interesting idea, but it has ceilings to it because it suggests the personality is the most important thing, that comes back. Certainly aspects of mediumship, which we'll talk about in a minute with I know that mediums are out there, it's the personality that comes through, or the message from a person that comes through. And certainly with the Spiritualist Church and the Spiritualist Union, they want to prove the existence of life after death, which is a noble aim. I'm not knocking that. But does that very statement limit the fact that you're never going to see the gloop? Loads of questions. And to go back to what I started to talk about, all of these things exist. Our body exists and it's driven by our brain, and our brain creates a mind, and our mind can conceive of all kinds of possibilities. Our essential self is the essence at the core of it all, and it is learning all the time. And because it's learning all the time, it's gaining new experiences. And if we are reflective and don't get trapped in our own physical material hell, we eventually allow this part of ourselves to move on from us when the physical body ends, goes back to the gloop where its experience is shared for the benefit, for the understanding, for the knowledge, for maybe no greater purpose than just being. Because it's human values that need to put purposes to things. It's human values that need to define something that can't be defined. The cosmos, the universe, is totally transpersonal and is nothing to do, in my opinion, with personalities, with singular ideas of God, with singular ideas of hell, or singular ideas of heaven. And all of the religious texts, when you look at their core, are actually about understanding yourself and your connection to whatever you conceive the universe to be. The North American Indians call it Great Spirit. But in order to understand Great Spirit, they have to create images that are easy for them to latch onto. In Christianity, we create images we can latch onto. In paganism, we create images to latch onto. The images are not the thing. The images are expressions of the thing. And that's where I think particular religiosity and religious dogma falls apart, because the thing, the symbol of the thing becomes the thing, not the thing itself. So spirit, soul, mind, body are all animated in the material world, but there is a possibility for us to connect to something more profound, more powerful, and it happens to us, by the way. It begins to happen the moment you allow your own intuition to work. You start to see connections that you haven't seen before. And these connections are more powerful the more you're willing to relax and accept them. The danger is because we want to believe things, we take the perceptions or the intuitions and box them. Yeah. One last story. A friend of mine went on a Buddhist retreat a number of years ago because he couldn't quite get into the zone of understanding the nature of himself and the universe. And he went on this Buddhist retreat, and it was a 21-day retreat. And the retreat was pretty strict. Up at 5, doing some housework, out meditating all day. All the meals were in silence. There was a short period of time in the evening, and then once every 2 days, so they went to see one of the monks, and the monk would ask them some questions. And every day, my friend was getting more and more wound up because he didn't think he was getting there with his meditation, as if there was a there to get to. Right? And so every day he spoke to the head monk and said, "Look, I'm just not there." And the monk said, "Well, where are you expecting to be apart from here?" However, after 19 days of this, he was sitting under a tree in a sunny afternoon, and all of a sudden, he had the sensation that he was the tree, that he was the bird, that he was the leaves, that he was the sky, that in fact everything was him and he was everything. No words can describe that in any sense, right? But he was elated because part of his mind was going, I've got it, I understand this wonderful connection. Nothing else mattered but his connection to the sun shining on and the tree he was and the grass that he was and the flowers that he was. And when he saw the monk in the evening, he explained with great enthusiasm the experience that he's had, and the monk sat there listening. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when he'd finished, the monk was silent. And of course, my friend was exhausted with the retelling of this beautiful, wonderfully, incredibly transcendental experience. And the monk simply looked at him and said, well, don't get too attached to it. Really important lesson. And I think there's enough there for us to talk about now. So I shall close this now.